Alright everyone, you have a new round of polling that's been aggregated, and keep in mind I'm going to be discussing specifically the CNN polling, not because individual data points can be relied upon to be accurate, but because if there is a significant movement in a single poll that uses the same methodology and sample from one month to the next, it can show movement, if it is outside of the likelihood that it's just statistical noise. This is what we have. We have over the course of a month, if we're to believe CNN polling, and of course, as far as the absolute number, ignore that. It doesn't matter. There has been a 10-point shift towards Trump, in favor of Trump and against Biden over the course of a month in Battleground and matchup polling. That's significant because it's well outside of the margin of error. Even though it's only a single data point, what this does show us, this can show us with 99% certainty that there has been movement in favor of Trump, and it is significant movement. It's more than a couple of points. That's great for Trump, because supposedly his presidency is systemically collapsing. But of course, what's happened is the Democrats have begun to take damage because of the riots. I think that's ultimately what it is. If coronavirus didn't do anything, people were saying that his initial response, which was relatively well received, Trump's response to the epidemic, they thought that that was why he was gaining support there. For a while, he rose up above 48, I believe, at maximum. He was getting up towards 50. I said no. Actually, the movement that you're seeing is part of a much longer-term trend, and it's primarily economic in nature. His downturn, likewise, I don't think had much to do with coronavirus. He just bottomed out to his floor. He didn't fall below that. You would think that there would be considerably more damage if it were something as significant as epidemic response. Since then, he's rebounded a couple of points. He's potentially raised his floor. This, in my opinion, is more about the Democrats fucking themselves than Trump doing anything particularly noteworthy. The coronavirus response is ultimately, at this point, becoming a non-issue because more and more people are recognizing that the death rate from the virus is more meaningful than the number of cases. 1,000 people get sick and half of them die. 500 people have died. That's a tragedy. 1 million people get sick and one person dies. Well, you get a lot more sicknesses, highly transmissible, but only one person's dead. One is less than 500. The death rate is totally different. With coronavirus, it's fallen down now to the low single-digit range and still falling. This despite the fact that in some places the number of cases is still rising. Although that's not uniform at this point. It's beginning to slack off in some of these places too. Trump tweeting actually the other day about how the initial 6,000 deaths Cuomo caused in old folks' homes is now 11,000. So that's the new, I guess the CDC has tried to estimate the number of people that died as a result of his stupidity. And of course, he doesn't get blamed by the New Yorkers for that. For some reason, Cuomo's like the Teflon Don sort of thing. People just vote for him over and over, even though he's a total jackass. But these data points can't show us anything other than the movement. They can't show us the velocity of the movement. And they can't show us an absolute number. They can simply show us the direction in which things are moving. That's the only thing that single polls can ever show you. This comports, though, with other polls. Trump has regained in Rasmussen. He regained in YouGov. He regained across the board. That's why the aggregate is rising, and that's just his approval. If Trump's approval rises, you would expect a commensurate response in matchup polling. If Biden's support falls, which it appears to be doing slowly over time, again, you would expect that movement. And if you compact those two together, and then if you assume, and this I believe is possible, that a lot of independent voters are turned off by Kamala Harris, some of them might have decided to back Trump. But there's a problem. Matchup polling and approval are totally different numbers. Trump's approval and Trump's numbers in the matchup are not the same thing. You can approve of Trump, but you can also at the same time plan to vote for Biden because you like him more. You can disapprove of Trump, but still be voting for Trump fundamentally. It's totally different numeric. Still vote for him because you hate the Democrats worse. And that latter point is very important in this election. There is, I think, a large block of people that don't really like Trump. They may think he's bad on coronavirus. Maybe they blame him for the economic fallout from blue states locking everything down because they're dumb. They don't like how he's doing with China. They don't like him personally. They don't like the way he looks. They don't like the way he speaks. They think that he's out to lunch. But then they look over at the Democrats and they say, but Biden is worse. And there are liberals that make this argument reverse now, aren't there? There are plenty of people, I've seen it, people on the left, well, Biden is a jackass, he doesn't represent change, he's just a boring neolib, probably lead us into war. But Trump is orange man, he's bad because he's a racist, he's bad because he's demented or something. Which I think, of course, is the 180 from reality in that case, but people do make that argument. They show you all sorts of compilations of Trump saying weird shit, and they use it as evidence, but I can show you him saying weird shit in the 2000s, long before he was at the age that he would have Alzheimer's starting, statistically speaking, and already being somewhat incoherent, because he carefully groomed his speaking style around The Apprentice, basically. Mouthing off, saying whatever the fuck he wanted. Once he got to that point where he was truly at the top of the world economically and in the entertainment industry, he went full stern and just said whatever the hell came to mind because he didn't have to worry anymore. With Trump support in battleground states particularly rising, that's terrible for Biden because you got to understand there's a difference as well between national polling numbers, where Trump is doing a mediocre job and still, even according to this, is 4 points behind Biden, although that's a far cry from the considerably higher margin that he was behind him in previous polling, and that their polling movement. National polling doesn't take into consideration the fact that there are certain states in the United States that are heavily, heavily blue and have huge populations. California, New York. This drags potentially millions of additional votes and a huge amount of support into the Dem camp without adding anything to the election. You can win a state with 51% of the vote or with 80% of the vote. The number of electors that you get is the same. For electoral purposes, you don't want to win by 80% margins in a couple of states. You want to win in a whole bunch of states by 51, 52, 53%. That's how Trump won in 2016. He won a lot of states with small six-figure voting differentials in fairly large states like Florida. Didn't he win that by like 15,000 votes? Almost triggering Armageddon in the electoral. Says it almost looked like 2,000 all over again. There were a whole bunch of states that he won by small margins. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Florida. North Carolina. Hillary Clinton would have won Wisconsin and North Carolina and been damn close to winning the election already if she just campaigned harder. She, by the way, was her own worst enemy. She decided she wanted more money from Goldman Sachs. It was more important than connecting with the voters that clearly didn't want to connect with her. Biden doesn't have as much of a problem, by the way, optically, because he can always use coronavirus as an excuse not to go to rallies. Trump, meanwhile, even at his impromptu rallies, Trump's no longer holding mainline rallies. He prefers to make them largely digital, and so you'll have like 1 million people watching him online. And so he has these small airport runway crowds following him. And supposedly, by the way, this is a sign that there's low enthusiasm for Trump. No, it's a sign that Republican voters tend to be older. Therefore, they're more likely to be staying at home. People aren't traveling a lot right now, so really the only population that's going to show up for a rally are extreme super fans, journos that, they can write off the travel expense, I guess, make their fucking YouTube stream or whatever, and then people in the local area. Of course, even most of them won't show up. By the way, it's not problematic for Biden either. You can't expect huge crowds to show up during a pandemic in an era in which travel is twice as expensive and twice as convoluted. Nobody wants to deal with that just to see Biden or Trump speak. Even Trump's legendary levels of in-party enthusiasm. Would I like to see a Trump rally? Yeah, it would be kind of fun to do that, but I'm not going to travel halfway across the country, paying 2-3 times the normal airfare. It's dealing with restrictions in travel, dealing with restrictions in traffic, lodging, everything else under the sun. It's just not fun. It's a goddamn hassle. It's a chore. What 4 years ago would have been an entertaining vacation is now a goddamn hassle. You can't expect people outside of the local area to go through those hoops. It's just not going to happen. People are only doing staycations now. Because, oh yeah, I'm on vacation, which basically means I'm sitting in my living room watching YouTube. By the way, you should be tuning into the Styx Hexenhammer 666 channel. There are all sorts of other great channels too, but I happen to be biased. I think mine's the best. Trump support is rising, in the battleground states especially. Part of it is the result of rioting. Part of this is the backlash that many of us long expected would eventually happen against the Democrats. Again, not pro-Trump, but anti-Biden. Pro-law and order, which Trump has broadly capitalized upon. He's going to gain support from that. By the way, it's going to be disproportionately in places that are having this particular problem. One of those is Minnesota, which is now in play. Biden will struggle to hold on to Minnesota in this election unless Trump support goddamn craters. Well, as we've already seen, even at the worst, at the darkest hour, his support remained at about 41%. His floor is in the low 40s at this point. He's got 4 in 10 U.S. likely voters, which have sky-high enthusiasm and will all be going to the polls physically, by the way, all locked up behind him. The Democrats are scrambling to steal the election with this mail-in voting crap, because you can already request an absentee ballot if you've got a legitimate reason. There's no problem with going in person to vote. Look, you're allowed to protest, you're allowed to riot and burn cars and stuff, and half the time the DA won't even prosecute you for it. You can't go to the voting booth for 5 minutes and pull a fucking goddamn lever? Put some ink on a piece of paper? Oh, I'm afraid I'll get infected. Cough, cough, cough. Oh, yeah, I'm going to go out for the 3rd time this week to go throw rocks at the police. It's a healthy activity. I'm running around in the city. Oh, I get plenty of exercise. Going to the voting booth? Are you crazy? You want grandma to die? It's a bunch of fucking horseshit. Voters are beginning to punish the Democrats. And this, again, the Democrats love to overstretch. It's exactly the opposite of the Republicans, who like to not go far enough when handed a mandate. The Democrats, by and large, have embraced the rioters. They've covered their ass for several months now, calling them protesters, mobilizing the corporate media to cover their asses, but people are starting to get independent commentary more and more and more. Every single day there are fewer people paying attention to the legacy media and more people paying attention to people like yours truly. They're getting the truth on this channel. They're getting the truth if they're watching Andy Ngo, listening to Tim Pool. They're getting the truth if they're using a InfoWars platform, arguably, but they're not going to get it from CNN or whatever. Thankfully, no younger voters give a fucking shit about CNN. Their average audience age is 67 years old. That's, by the way, I think a couple years younger than the average Fox viewer. Fox with the most trusted name in news. No, not really. I mean, you got a bunch of losers on there, basically. I know there's a Cucker Carlson cult of personality, but I'm not taken in, dude. I'm not taken in by millionaires telling me what's best for me as an average American. That's about all. Peace out.